Good evening again, everyone. My name is John Smith, and I'm the Executive Co-Director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. This evening, we once again welcome API Associate Torrey Byles from Morro Bay, California, as our speaker. And this is a follow-up to Torrey's talk last October on the philosophy of money, and is entitled The Ontology of Money, Part 2, Developments in Philosophy. So we're actually doing philosophy this time, which is great. So I'm going to say over to you, Torrey.
Okay, well, thank you, John, and greetings, everybody from the API. I'm pleased to be here. And you should start seeing my screen now. Is that successfully coming through? Have I shared the screen successfully? Does everybody see what the first slide of my...
Yeah, I can see it, Torrey. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, just checking. Great. So yeah, as John said, I'm going to finish my talk from October and complete the talk on the ontology of money. And as promised, look at the developments in philosophy, the paradigm shifts, I'm calling them, since the Enlightenment, that will help economics resolve its confusions around the ontology of money. And let me get my slides going. Okay. So if you remember last time, we covered the first 3 points, a general introduction where, again, I was saying how both fields of philosophy and economics since the time of Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant and David Hume, so forth, have both undergone developments. Philosophy's developments really were pretty radical in terms of metaphysics because it overturned the Cartesian duality that arose during the scientific revolution of the 17th century. To today, we have a much more sophisticated kind of metaphysical paradigm. And it's that paradigm that I'm going to say today is going to help make economics a more coherent theory, particularly around a money economy. So I talked about the ontology of money, and then I talked about the problems in economics dealing with money and how it was leading to various confusions. So this time I'm going to talk about the Cartesian metaphysics particularly, and then the shift away from those metaphysics that we find ourselves in today, and look at some of these subtopics there: the philosophy of language, the philosophy of the human sciences or psychology and sociology and the other human sciences, or philosophy of mind. Briefly say something about Kant's and Hume's mistake, and generally just describe the new metaphysical paradigm that we have today. And then I'll basically, I want one or two slides just about the economic process as a conversational process and a semiotic process, a process of exchanging signs. And then very little about theory and policy, but we'll see how much time we have for that, because that gets complicated. And remember, what we're really trying to do is get a theory of money, but as Schumpeter said, a theory of money it indicates a theory of the entire economic process. So whether these other areas of economics, supply and demand, interdependency, theory of value, theory of justice, these all have to do with economics, but until we get the theory of money right first, it won't be, those come secondary to getting the theory of money right. So right off the bat, we have to separate these two objectives. Okay, let's just jump into the ontology of money, just to review the ontology of money, what I said last time. Money has this strange phenomenological or metaphysical quality. It is observer dependent. It does not exist like rocks and trees exist. It only exists in the minds of observers. But because it's recognized by everybody in a community, it's an objective fact of that community. So its existence depends on the beliefs the community has towards money, towards the object that is money. It does not have any physical substance, essentially, even though we have credit cards and coins and paper and things like that. It really is a sign that sets up action. And it's like all other economic institutions, like property and corporations and governments and corporate structures, even cocktail parties and Zoom webinars for that matter. It's a purely kind of subjective thing that exists in the mind of the observers. So and yet, even though it only exists in the mind, it's not just some subjective opinion or fantasy. It's when the whole community believes in it that it becomes an object that's independent of any personal opinions, and becomes an objective fact of the user community of money. Let's just see here. One of the points that I'm going to emphasize is that the cause of action that money is not material or efficient as things are in the Cartesian physical world. The causation in money comes from the money contracts that are set up between people, and it is a formal and final, and you can say a deontic causation that we're talking about. People commit to and perform the specific obligations of the money contract. So causation is an ethical, rational act of conscience. It is not a physical force like we have posited in physics and sort of natural physical world. So, by using this sign that money is, we create relationships between people. The basic ones: buyer and seller, employer, employee, lender, borrower, or simply a giver and a taker or a receiver. Money doesn't exist outside of these interpersonal, interhuman relationships. So that's the brief explanation of money, or brief explanation of the ontology of money. One more point is, as an ethical, rational cause, money's power to alter human action and subsequently the world is invoked in moments of the contract. So it results in this sort of punctuated, discrete changes to human actions and activities. This is, again, different from the continuous change by a persistent force, as you would find in physics. So we can consider any persistent force in money as a sort of a sustained commitment by people to fulfill the obligations of the contract. But again, this is a different form of persistence than, say, a physical force. So this allows us to sort of outsmart time, so to speak. Money has the power to coordination, but has a power to coordinate action, but does not have to be present in every moment. It gives us greater degrees of freedom and flexibility to each individual this way. And just on the promise of a payment tomorrow, action can take place today. And among other factors, this feature allows us to increase the speed at which we do things, including especially consume resources. We can outsmart time with money and attain real wealth sooner than we otherwise would. Now, I'm going to just say one more thing about the money problems in economics. And this is kind of a restatement of what we went over last time, but I'm going to say it in kind of a different way. In a similar way to outsmarting time, we can also outsmart our physical capacity for work by using money. This is kind of leverage. There's financial leverage, there's operational leverage, and I'm really talking about operational leverage. And this is a variation on Keynes's meaning of a monetary production economy, and even Adam Smith's division of labor principle that societies that use money can simply produce more than those who don't, can physically produce more than those who don't. So there's that kind of operational leverage that monetary production economies have. But almost every economist I know thinks of productivity as a measure of physical work but it's not a thermodynamic. I think one of the confusions about money is that, especially the concept of productivity, is that it allows for work in a thermodynamic or energetic sense to happen, but this is not the case. So in other words, if you're a writer, your physical productivity would be how many sentences per day do you write. So your productivity could go up and down based on the physical number of sentences. For example, if you assemble automobiles, a thermodynamic understanding of work or productivity would be how many automobiles per day do you make? And if you're a plumber, how many fixed pipes do you complete per day? So that's sort of a thermodynamic sense of work. But productivity in economics in a money using economy is not that kind of measure. What it really is a measure of return on invested money, and is one of the many interest rates that play important roles in calibrating the worth of assets and activities, such as profit, interest on loan money, capital gain, sales commission, royalty, and so forth. So return on investment is a general measure of money received from some activity divided by the money that it took to invoke or pay for the labor and other expense items that went into that activity. So we have, for example, Lloyd Bankfine, the president of Goldman Sachs Bank, he said Goldman Sachs employees are the most productive workers in the world. Well, that's not a thermodynamic sense of productivity. That's a return on investment, because most, per employee compensation at Goldman Sachs is very, very high. But so once a society starts using money and defines monetary production as a type of economic order of activity, then all things that can be useful to make money, whether it's labor, land, money, etc., can be given a separate pseudo value in terms of return on investment. And the rational choice among several ROIs to choose from is to pick the very highest one and pursue that. And all of this is kind of a roundabout way of saying financialization and prematistics, which was Aristotle's word for financialization, become the end game and the desiderata of monetary production. And that's what we're experiencing now in the world economy. So what you have one of the problems in economics is that we have, if we go by the sort of classic Greek definition of economy of managing and distributing real resources among people of a household, then in a monetary production economy, this only occurs some of the time. Only occasionally does money fulfill that mandate of household management in the Greek sense. There's a very significant other domain where the expansion of the money supply in the community is just accelerated consumption and financialization, according to some average positive interest rate. So the average positive interest rate, and we can talk to your point, John, it's a real interest rate, a positive real interest rate, a nominal interest rate discounted for inflation, is still not a naturally occurring growth rate, but merely an iterated, what I'm going to say is an iterated mathematical function where the dependent variable result of one period is fed back into the function, the same function, as the independent variable of the next period. This is, I'm not going to get into this anymore, but this is kind of one of the things I want to eventually look into. But money economies are not stable, and at some point their nominal size will exceed the Earth's capacity, Earth's physical capacity of material resources and energy to reproduce itself in an unchanged form. Again, kind of roundabout ways of saying some of the problems that we're having in a money economy. Okay, so how does philosophy help out for these kinds of problems in economics? And we discussed some of these. We discussed the issues that I just kind of covered last time anyway. I just sort of got a little more wordy about them. So to make sense of these, we need to look at the metaphysics of the social system, such as the ontology of money. And classical economics, as well as contemporary economics, had no real intellectual resources in the form of philosophical distinctions that you have in metaphysics, for example, to be able to do what we need to do. And where some economists have attempted to employ these philosophical issues, they have done so in very primitive or incomplete ways. And I'm kind of thinking of monetarists, the Austrian subjective school of economics, and generally the neoclassical, neoliberal camps of economics have tried to do some philosophical understandings of things, but not in a complete or sophisticated way. So now remember, so let's talk about the Cartesian metaphysics and the Enlightenment. So remember that Descartes and the rest of the scientists and the philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, John Locke, Newton, for example, Galileo, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, George Berkeley, there was a strong, rigid dualism. There were two realms, the realm of matter, the realm of mind. And this played into an ancient duality coming from the Greeks of an idealistic world of Plato's ideas, and then there's the physical real world, two different worlds. And clearly this is false. There's only one world, but this dualism is a very pragmatic way to approach studying the physical natural world. It's the disengaged observer, the view from nowhere, so to speak. Now, but money, as I said earlier, is not inherently physical. It is a sign. It's a quantity of credit in one's possession. And all the parties have to understand it beforehand to see it and to enable the potential for action to come about and money to do work. These shared beliefs. Now, what these things are, these intersubjective beliefs and objects that institutions are, like money, elude Cartesian analysis. Cartesian analysis does not see these things. But what's important to remember that shared beliefs like money or property or other economic institutions, and they are intersubjective objects and meanings, but they are not clear and explicit ideas always in our heads. Like Descartes and Locke and even Plato believed that all ideas had to be. So that for the individual, I'm talking, for an individual, a shared belief doesn't necessarily have to be explicitly conscious in the mind, but they are embedded where these ideas are, and the descriptions and accounts that we can say money and other beliefs have regarding their existence, is they are embedded in our behaviors and our relations with people. So the belief in money is typically kind of an unconscious belief for the most part, because after you learn about money as you're growing up, we conduct our living practices habitually. And so these social ontological things, they exist in our habitual behavior, which which even though unconscious, we can still be rational in our habits. So it's rational but unconscious. We don't have to consciously think through what we're doing every time when we buy groceries at the supermarket. So the dualism of idealism versus material realism, or mind versus body, as absolutely separate realms, is a false dichotomy. Human practices, actions with purposes, are the kinds of things that make sense to human actors. So because certain ideas are internal to the practice, you can't distinguish the two, the action or the idea that the action expresses. So thus, because you cannot distinguish the practice from the idea, you cannot assign or distinguish one as causing the other, which is how a lot of people think the dualistic Cartesian metaphysics works. You know, is it an idea that's explaining the action, or the action explains the idea? Human practices are both material and ideal at once, and human self-understanding are the essential condition of the practice to make sense to the participants of the practice. The causes of the action, which would be personally our account or our ideas, indeed our theory of why we're acting, why we're doing these things according to social institutions, these causes, these ideas, are one with the very action itself. Social theory and action are one and the same with intersubjective beliefs and objects. So, where are we here? Last week. Sorry about that. Oh. What I'm gonna put the paradigm shift in this metaphysical paradigm shift that I'm explaining here, trying to explain, and put it all under the name of the semiotic revolution that has occurred since the 18th century. So since the time of Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Kant. Succinctly stated, it's the development of semiotics, or the theory of meanings and signs. It has also been called the interpretive or linguistic or hermeneutic turn. And even as in the case of Heidegger, it's called the end of metaphysics altogether, or in the case of Charles Sanders Peirce, pragmatism. To study money and all social institutions and social objects such as money or baseball games or cocktail parties or Zoom webinars, you have to see how these things are constituted in cultural rules and legislated norms, and these things can be described in language. Causality with social objects, shared intersubjective beliefs such as money, is not efficient or material. It is formal, final, and deontic. One commits to perform the actions that constitute the practice. So as I've already said these things. And it's the causality is not a physical force, but it's intellectual reason. It is not always conscious, but it is embedded in our action and our habits. But one of the things to see here is with money, as with all language and semiotics, we transcend from being sort of mere animals subject to urges, instincts, and hardwired behaviors, and we become more Homo sapiens who act according to reasons. So money is part of a development of semiotics that has, in my thesis here, is that it's the long rise of a rational species, the Homo sapien. It's a form of language that has provided greater and greater rational capability on the part of the Homo sapien, or human beings. Now, one of the so what we're doing when we study semiotics and the interpretive approach to economics is really a kind of semiotic activity. And what we're doing is we're studying the nature of a socially imposed order. And in order to do that, we use interpretation, hermeneutics, or self-witness, or impartial observer. Hermes comes from the hermeneutics comes from the Greek god of communication, Hermes, also god of commerce, and or the patron saint of commerce and thieves. And it's the general idea is interpreting the part from the whole and the whole from the part. There's a what people call a hermeneutic circle. So what that means is to interpret the use of money and other economic institutions, and what you're doing is you've already participated to some degree in these practices. You're investigating them as a kind of self-reflection. You assess the enculturated person that you are. You reflect on the community and culture in which you live. So for money, for example, one looks at the style of living that money engenders. Here you might think of things like, you're careful to remain solvent, to stay within a budget, we account for things, we punctually track time. Transaction with people are strategic. At the same time that we seek money for its purchasing power, we're paying close attention to how we can show up to other people that they may pay us with money for something they want. In other words, we're watching the market for opportunities to see how we might supply those market demand areas in which we have a productive capacity. All this gives us freedom to accumulate possessions. Money gives us control and autonomy in our lives. But this lack of a strict duality, a la Descartes and Locke, makes for a different kind of scientific investigation than in the physical science. It involves self-interpretation. So this is how I am kind of defining or at least identifying the constituent components of the rise in semiotics. And in particular, there were two specific sort of discourses in philosophy and sub-disciplines in philosophy, the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of language had its roots in the 18th century with such thinkers as Jean-Baptiste Vico, Johann Herder, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Johann Hamann, and their focus was on how language in a community shapes the outlook of members of the speaking community, even though each member and the conversations may evolve the meanings and the uses of the language. In the area of the philosophy of mind, I'm including all the human sciences, which of course there are many disciplines, but they all look at human behavior and cognition. And even the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment with such things as the existentialism of Kierkegaard, who focused on the meaningfulness of life or the lack thereof, and not just a strict theory of knowledge and rational proof of truthfulness, for which Kant was focused on. It was meaningfulness, not truth. And this was taken up later by Nietzsche, people like William James, Freud, and then these joined the philosophical discussions of philosophers like Peirce, Dilthey, Husserl, Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and the ordinary language philosophers in Oxford in the 1950s, John Austin and John Searle. And another strand that fed into this is the disciplines of math and logic, where the revolutionary developments in math and logic in the 19th century come to mind. So think of Riemann geometry, Boolean algebra, propositional logic and calculation. Thinkers here were looking for the logical and mistakenly psychological foundations of mathematics, and also the math foundations of logic. And these pursuits merged into quests for understanding the logic of reasoning and language with such thinkers as Frege, Bertrand Russell, and even in our time, Chomsky. And then there's the use of statistics and theories of induction and the logic of question and answers, which were a complete departure from classic logic of Aristotle that had dominated logic for 2,000 years. So altogether, I'm throwing these together as the revolution in semiotics. And by the way, some of the classical economists contributed to some of these developments: John Stuart Mill, Whately, and Nassau Sr., Jevons, Marx, with his roots, and Hegel. So let's see here. So let me just speak to two general points here, one coming from the philosophy of language. So knowledge comes out of a cooperative process of group life mediated by language. That's a quote from Karl Mannheim, who was a student of Martin Heidegger. But the philosophy of language and mind and the semiotics all contributed to new vistas on the intersection of thought, language, and science and reality. So the revolution in language, simply stated, was to see that language and all signs are more than just depicting the world as the original scientists wanted language to be. But it's actually more than that. Human expression in language and in signs somehow constitute the world, constitute our reality. Certain ways of being and feeling and relating to other people can only be expressed through language and other even non-language signs like gestures or clothes you wear, things like that, media. Thinking is the finding of beliefs by which to form habits of practical living. That's a Peircean quote. Truth is found in the action, the effects, the habits that mental conceptions allow one to take and adopt. Again, intersubjective meanings and depictions of reality come about through communication with other people. We know the world by doing and making, and this knowledge then enters into subsequent doings and makings, so that the truth is found in the successful doing, the successful action, the action that is successful. And because we, through scientific investigation and reflection, discover the successful way to act, we can say that, in effect, our truth is what we have made ourselves to know. So there's this sort of Promethean power that we have in thinking and expressing what we find to be true about our world. It also helps to create and discover and disclose new parts of the world in which we live. So truth is disclosed by, in effect, retrospection on completed actions, on history, on the results of experiments, and so forth. And truth guides future prospective action, how action would be completed rationally, even though it might lead not to successful action that we're trying to do. But again, it feeds back, and eventually we will see the successful way to do things. So what I'm describing here is knowledge is evolutionary. And some of this was already seen in other non-Western cultures. For example, one of my favorites is the Chinese philosopher and statesman Wang Yangming of the 12th century, who said, knowledge is the beginning of action, action is the completion of knowledge. So one of the results of philosophy of language in particular, but it obviously ties into philosophy of mind and these other areas, that philosophers such as Heidegger and Wittgenstein became aware that it's not representation that is primary to truth and meaning, but it's actually the action that is what engenders truthfulness and meaningfulness. We know the world by our doing and making, and this produced knowledge enters into subsequent doings and makings. It is a movement, which is to say time, that allows intelligence to come forth and interpret its situation. And in doing this, intelligence generates knowledge. Okay, I think I've said enough on that. But so intelligence is a kind of mental action, just like thinking and speaking even are kinds of actions, and is just along the lines of movement of the human body over time with purposeful behavior, which is, either you're doing science or you're running an enterprise or engaging in work or doing sports or shopping. Action is the expression of your knowledge, so to speak. And language is more than merely designating objects and with words, like the early scientists wanted to believe, and like the pressures for being objective require. It goes further than just designating things with words. It allows us to commit and make nature conform to a particular form in the future. When we make requests and promises, we're promising a different reality in the future. Language also allows us to alter nature in the very moment by stating that it is altered. I could say right now, this is the end of my presentation, and that would be an action that alters the reality that we're in. So we can, by declaring things, we make things real. And this is how, for example, money comes into existence. A banking network or a bank declares a credit line to a borrower, and now there's more money in the system. So speaking and expressing in signs is action itself. But this doesn't mean that just anything goes and we can just say whatever we want and it will appear, and that all beliefs are equal. The fact is, some interpretations are better than others, and interpretations can be rationally dissected and arbitrated, and the more truthful ones become acceptable and become more performative than others. And this is one of the, by the way, I'm speaking here to the second half of the 20th century, where philosophers like Michel Foucault or Derrida or Lacan, even Jürgen Habermas, have somewhat stated a little bit too aggressively that, or Richard Rorty for that matter, that we can create whatever world we want, or there's no such thing as truth either. And we still live within the resistances of the real world, and we cannot just say anything we want as if it's going to be a fact of the world. Language allows us to make facts of all kinds, and but some of our theories, and we can make up any kind of theory that we want, but it still has to stand the test of those resistances of our existence. So another thing that's been confused with this metaphysical shift is on sort of the other end of the spectrum, and that on the sort of political, on the political spectrum. And that's where, because we have to start every situation for understanding the world and understanding reality and making an assessment of our situation, it sounds like we are it's a conservative kind of philosophy, that it endorses the status quo and it just recapitulates the status quo. But the fact is, we are actually always progressing, and science and human knowledge is never complete. It's continually being improved, and knowledge is evolutionary. So it's not conservative, and it's not anything goes. This new kind of understanding, this metaphysics of language. Now, the other thing about philosophy of language, and coming into the philosophy of mind now, that the individual mind, including a psychology of self-identity and emotions, comes out of the body's existence in a network of relations mediated and constituted in language. We express our way of being in the world. Language gives us a reflective awareness that we can communicate. And then, the more sophisticated vocabulary of emotions, like in psychology, makes our emotional life more sophisticated and more deep. The human self is a series of relations. In a monetary economy, we have your identity becomes very defined in different kinds of relations. You're a buyer, you're a seller, you're a borrower, you're a lender. You have certain kind of occupation, you have another kind of occupation. The individual self, even to the person, the individual the individual self is a sign. We reflect on ourselves as some conceptual understanding of ourselves. In a way, there's no such thing as an individual, but only relations. Okay, so we produce our identities not in our innermost self, but in a public network of conversations. And that network is itself embedded within a multiplicity of historical discourses, and it is constantly changing through our own and others' participation and our mutual responses to that participation. Kant and Hume's mistake was making a theory of knowledge based on an individual mind and not seeing the socially conditioned and constructed aspect of the individual self. And Kant and Hume thought that all knowledge validation could be done purely individually within a single individual and not through a social process of communication. And today's liberalism, and I mean liberalism in the classic sense of liberal markets, free markets, liberalism, you may call it neoliberalism now, focuses and finds the nominal differences, the nominal particulars that separate and divide each one of us from everyone else, rather than looking at the commonalities and the generally shared spirit that unite us as a society. So we've kind of gotten into this hyper individualist philosophy and sociology these days with liberalism and neoliberalism. So how can this new, so that's the metaphysical paradigm shift in philosophy, and how can it help look at economics? And hopefully I've triggered some thinking towards how it might help. So if we look at money can be thought of as an invented sign to use in conversations to coordinate action. And banks produce it, they ration it out as loans, and households and producers use it to set prices and wages. These are done through declarative speech actions and within conversations that are intended to coordinate commerce and employment in the public market. This language game of money sets up distributed, coordinated social action. It produces a reproducing order, which is the production-consumption order of society. So the big issue is how to constrain the money creation and use process to support a living order of society that does not allow unnecessary concentrations of power, does not allow a creation of artificial scarcity, and allows for a reduced cost of living through technical innovation, and not alter the planet, that the planet itself remains unreproducible in its current condition. Those are some of the challenges. And what I think it goes to is something I've been working for the last 20 years or so, is this communitarian-based economy. Economics becomes kind of a community scenario deliberation in order to create rules for interaction and reproducible collective action. We use language to build our social reality. We invent social institutions by agreeing on rules of behavior, rules of use, and then we promise to abide by those rules. Once built and widely adopted, it is as if the social institutions that we make also shape our behavior. And this obviously applies to economic institutions, property, corporate structures, money. And we can use quantitative models and again, scenario and discussions and deliberations in various venues to clarify values and what we're trying to do overall as the local economy. And there's economists already who are taking this sort of semiotic approach. Well, they might not call it semiotic, but it's this sort of collaborative, interdisciplinary approach. Eleanor Ostrom, for example, Faye Duchin, who is one of the disciples of who's the input-output guy, should know that, but Faye Duchin in industrial ecology, where you have scientists and economists and occupational groups working out large common resource usage programs and circular manufacturing schemes. Anne Rawls, who's the daughter of John Rawls, the political philosopher in Harvard, is also working up a theory of interactive constitutive orders, working off of the Wittgenstein and the ordinary language philosophers in a very sociological approach. Jane Jacobs, Michael Schumann are some more economists who are doing this communitarian-based stuff. And then the communitarian philosophers, Michael Sandel at Harvard, Charles Taylor in Montreal, and Amitai Etzioni is another name. And then some of the things that I've done, it's just on the West Coast of North America here. There's different ways of looking at self-sufficient economies. A lot of it has to do with encouraging everything in every possible way, local ownership of economic assets. So finance is really important, restricting out of region organizations and financiers of buying things inside the region, and creating even regional stock markets, regional credit unions, and even regional currencies, sustaining the local population. There's a lot of work there, and a lot of even economic theory on going all the way to currency zones and that kind of thing that encourage this kind of local economy movement. Yeah, and so one of the effects of this slide indicates is that groups can live according to their regional value systems, so to speak, and lifestyle, the lifestyle that they seek. So that's my talk, and I think I'll stop sharing the screen, and we can go back to you, John, I guess, we can facilitate a question and answer session now.